Why is there a Federal Bar Association? Because the founding documents of the United States of America enshrine the rule of law in its institutions, in every function, at every level. And someone needs to honor and uphold that. Upon their knowledge, efficiency, ability, honesty, and zeal very much depends. The FBA's founding president, James W. Whitten, said of the legal professionals who work for the federal government, because upon them rests the important and responsible duty to know the laws, to say what they mean, to tell how they should be applied, and to help them in their execution. And to no other class of officers are assigned duties of greater importance, or work upon the proper doing of which the welfare of our government more largely depends. Indeed, the welfare of the government, and of the United States as a nation and a society, is the work of the thousands of attorneys and judges who are members of the Federal Bar Association. And the story of the FBA's first 100 years, from 1920 to 2020, is at the same time the story of America and the American century. It was January of 1920. The Boston Red Sox traded Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees. The Treaty of Versailles brought World War I to a formal end, and prohibition became law across the United States. And in Washington, D.C., on January 5, 1920, a group of U.S. government attorneys formed a new professional organization called the Federal Bar Association. Some of them had come together the year before, when a congressional committee tasked with overhauling federal employee compensation practices had solicited testimony from groups of professionals working in civil service. A member of the Solicitor's Office of the U.S. Department of the Interior testified on behalf of federal attorneys. His name was James W. Whitten, and he made a strong case for paying his colleagues a more competitive wage. Afterward, Whitten thought the federal law community could use a more official, permanent alliance, and thus was born the FBA. There were 438 initial members. Annual dues were $2. Whitten served as the first president. The architecture of this ambitious new organization grew quickly. There were monthly meetings featuring distinguished speakers and annual meetings to elect officers. There were annual banquets as well, sometimes broadcast nationwide on the radio. And there was a growing number of local chapters, formed in Nashville, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Los Angeles, and other cities. In 1931, the FBA launched the Federal Bar Association Journal, its first publication. In 1938, the organization officially incorporated in Washington, D.C., stating as its objective to advance the science of jurisprudence, to promote the administration of justice, and to uphold a high standard for the federal judiciary and for attorneys representing the government of the United States. In these founding years, the roll call of national presidents and the agencies where they worked, including the Departments of Interior, Justice, State, Agriculture, and War, served as a testament to the close relationship that existed between the FBA and the federal bar and bench, and still does. The next 20 years laid the foundation for everything the FBA would become. They began routinely enough with a 20th anniversary celebration in January of 1940. A new monthly publication called Federal Bar News debuted in October of 1940, and FBA delegates attended the first meeting of the Inter-American Bar Association in Havana in March of 1941. But when the United States entered World War II in December of 1941, the FBA responded like the rest of the country did, by swinging into action. A War Work Committee was formed to provide general aid to the winning of victory wherever the assistance of a legal professional can be effective in this direction. FBA members enlisted and served. As soldiers, sailors, and pilots, they fought. As lawyers and judges, they oversaw war contracts, administered military justice, and eventually drafted peace treaties. On the home front, the FBA scaled back its activities, but never stopped. The first female national president, Marguerite Rewalt, was elected in 1943. The semi-annual Federal Bar Association Journal became the quarterly Federal Bar Journal in 1944. And in January of 1945, a senior attorney working for the Department of Justice named Louis MEHLINGER, born to a freed slave in Mississippi in 1882, became the first African-American member of the Federal Bar Association. When the war was won, there were diplomacy and statecraft to pursue, a United Nations to build, a new world order to secure. FBA members were part of all that, with former and future national presidents helping prosecute the Nuremberg war crimes trials, serving as U.S. Attorney General and then on the Supreme Court, and drafting the legislation that created NASA. Membership continued to grow, from 1,200 in 1940 to 2,600 in 1954 to 8,400 by 1960. In 1954, an act of Congress created the Foundation of the Federal Bar Association to support the FBA's mission through research and education projects. And 4 years later, in 1958, the FBA took its most ambitious step, incorporating the Federal Bar Building Corporation. Its mission, to build the FBA a home. The FBA broke ground on the 12-story, $3 million Federal Bar Building on June 30, 1960. Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren himself wielded the shovel. Dedicated in January of 1962, the building at 1815 H Street, Northwest in Washington, D.C., was home to office space for the FBA's national staff, a law library, and the National Lawyers Club, which soon became a social hub for the federal legal community. For the country, this was a time when it seemed like everything was coming apart. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy and King assassinations, Vietnam, the struggle for civil rights, the Watergate scandal. Through it all, members of the Federal Bar Association provided critical U.S. institutions with stability and guidance. It was a federal district judge who swore in Lyndon B. Johnson as president when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And it was federal attorneys who helped write, enact, and enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. One of them, a former FBA president who became Attorney General. And it was federal attorneys who staffed the office of the special counsel that investigated Watergate. These were growth years for the FBA. The foundation of the FBA published a popular book about the Supreme Court in 1965. The national staff expanded, including hiring a full-time executive director in 1966. And in 1967, the Federal Bar Building was joined by the Federal Bar Building West, just next door at 1819 H Street. In 1972, another FBA president became Attorney General, but resigned within 10 months amid the growing Watergate investigation. 2 years later, the FBA presented the first Earl W. Kintner Award for Distinguished Service, named after the legendary former president who was the driving force behind the Federal Bar Building Corporation. And in 1976, the organization spread its wings even wider, creating the Continuing Legal Education Board of the FBA, launching the Indian Law Conference, and for the first time, holding the annual meeting outside the continental United States, in Puerto Rico. On the eve of the 1980s, total membership approached 15,000, with more than 100 chapters, and a great new mission was just ahead. In 1980, the FBA installed its first African-American national president, Dr. J. Clay Smith, Jr. An optimistic start to a decade that also began with a revamped publication, now called the Federal Bar News and Journal, and devoted to increasingly ambitious coverage of the federal legal community. Everywhere you looked, democracy was on the rise. Between when the FBA honored the 200th anniversaries of the U.S. Constitution in 1987 and the Bill of Rights in 1991, the Berlin Wall came down. Then the Eastern Bloc fell apart, and the Soviet Union dissolved. And the FBA was ready. Its Democracy Development Initiative sent member volunteers to Eastern Europe and Russia to lend their expertise to creating democratic institutions that fostered the rule of law, including helping draft the new Russian Constitution. At home, the FBA continued its own ascent. In 1993, 50 years after Marguerite Rewalt broke the glass ceiling, the organization swore in its second female national president. 2 years later came the FBA's 75th anniversary, celebrated with a party at the Supreme Court, and the latest evolution of the FBA's main publication, now a sleek, stylish magazine called The Federal Lawyer. FBA members were kept busy navigating issues such as industry deregulation, HIV, AIDS law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, mandatory minimum sentencing, and the Defense of Marriage Act. And during this newly electronic age, with digital technology not just changing how federal law was practiced, but creating new areas for FBA members to regulate and interpret, every front-page story seemed to play out through the federal legal system, from the breakup of AT&T to the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. As a new century approached, the FBA looked to the future. It launched the Thurgood Marshall Moot Court Competition to better engage the next generation of federal legal professionals, hired its first professional government affairs advocate to better represent the interests of members, created its first website, and, most dramatically of all, sold the 2 federal bar buildings, the FBA's H Street home, for 35 years. The new headquarters was still in Washington, D.C., but it was smaller, more appropriately scaled, perfect for a group that was becoming ever more nimble and responsive. The new century placed FBA members right in the thick of things from the outset, thanks to Bush v. Gore, a Supreme Court case that determined a presidential election. And these years never really let up. The September 11th terrorist attacks and the subsequent war on terror had an impact on the federal bar and bench that rivaled World War II. Fought in courtrooms and legal briefs as much as on battlefields, and turning on concepts such as enemy combatants and enhanced interrogation. Meanwhile, the foundation of the FBA established the September 11th Relief Fund to benefit victims of the attacks. The early 2000s also saw FBA members involved with the aftermath of corporate and accounting scandals, such as Enron and WorldCom. And, over the following decade, with the Affordable Care Act, same-sex marriage, mass shootings, and gun control, the Muslim travel ban, #MeToo, the special counsel investigation into election interference by Russia, and the impeachment of President Donald Trump. The FBA stayed busy, partnering with the American Bar Association on 2 reports about stagnating judicial salaries that were presented to the Chief Justice of the United States in 2001 and 2003. In 2002, the Foundation created a Fellows Program, including an honorary Life Fellows component that eventually would induct 8 Supreme Court justices, and over the following years, establish relief funds to help victims of Hurricane Katrina and other natural disasters. The FBA presented the first Sarah T. Hughes Civil Rights Award, named for the Texas federal judge who swore in Lyndon Johnson on Air Force One, in 2003. In 2007, the organization moved one more time, finally leaving Washington, D.C., its home for 87 years, and settling in its current location in Arlington, Virginia. Perhaps most impressively, the FBA fulfilled its commitment to the full diversity of the federal bar and bench, installing its first Hispanic national president. followed by its first female African American president, and its first Native American president. To say nothing of the first Article III judge, and the first magistrate judge to serve in the role. All of them together, along with every other national president and board officer and chapter leader and member, are the face of the Federal Bar Association at 100. This is not the full history of the FBA's first 100 years. It can't be. Too many people made too many contributions to too many projects, initiatives, and campaigns for the betterment of the federal legal community to cover in one place. We encourage you to seek out their stories in the Federal Bar Association Centennial book and on the Centennial website at fedbar100.org. What will the FBA's next 100 years look like? What will this organization become? What will it do? The future is unwritten, but it seems safe to say that as long as there is an FBA, it will advance the science of jurisprudence, promote the administration of justice, and uphold a high standard for the federal judiciary and for attorneys practicing in U.S. courts. Let's end where we began, with the words of James W. Whitten. The character and importance of the work demanded of law service of our government cannot be overestimated. Our government had its birth in fundamental law, and it lives and thrives on obedience to law.
I'm so excited to sit down today with Chris Durso, Associate Vice President of Content for MCI USA and the lead researcher and author of our Centennial book. Chris's impressive 25-year career as an association editor and writer can now include federal bar historian. So Chris, thanks so much for joining us for our world premiere of the Centennial video. So tell me a little bit about, where did you find 100 years worth of information about the FBA?
You know, it was really an interesting project, Stacy, and I'm not just saying that. I'm really not. The interesting thing about the FBA is, first of all, as you know, the person who is the steward of these things, the FBA has a lot of records. It has a lot of historic photos. It has 90 years worth of publications, starting with the Federal Bar, what was the Federal Bar Association Journal, which started in 1931. But the really interesting thing about the FBA is that right from day one, right from January of 1920, it was featured in the local papers of Washington, D.C., because every what I would call professional social organization was featured in that. You know, like a big thing was people going out and going to meetings of their professional societies, of their fraternal societies, and at least at the very beginning, the FBA was one of those. And so right from the start, there is, if you search newspaper records from that time, there are listings about the FBA's monthly evening meetings that were held at the Interior Department building in Washington, D.C. every month, featuring distinguished speakers. And there are notifications about these annual dinners that the FBA would have that sometimes were broadcast nationwide on the radio, depending on who the speaker was. So that was really just a big help to this project. The fact that the FBA right from the start was a pretty high profile organization, and it's been kind of part of the public record of this country since it started, and really right up until today. You know, it also still turns up in the newspapers today.
So how did the book come to be organized the way that it is?
You more than anybody probably know that the FBA is really big and complicated, and you cannot tell the story from A to B to C all the way to Z and not leave something out. I mean, there's too many people who contributed. The organization has done way too much. And so we decided to take what I guess I would call a mosaic approach, which is just really spotlighting certain elements in this sort of fragmented way, in the hope that the fragments would sort of then come together and show you a whole picture. So we have this listing of what we call the Hall of Presidents, which is every single national president and not just the years they served, not just their picture, but the title and the agency until when everybody used to work for an agency and now the law firm or whoever, but kind of the title and the affiliated organization that everybody worked for. And so if you read all of them through the years, you really see just how closely involved the FBA has been with the federal government and vice versa. So that's Hall of Presidents. We also have this recurring feature called From the Headlines, which takes a headline from the FBA's national publication. Like I said earlier, it started with the Federal Bar Association Journal. Today it's the Federal Lawyer. And in between that, it went through a few other iterations. But we took one headline that just seemed representative of each year to reflect what federal legal professionals were dealing with. And so if you see, and I should say it's not 100 years worth, it's 90 years worth, because like I said, the first journal didn't start until 1931. So, but it's really, that to me is almost the meat of things, because simply looking at these 90 years worth of headlines, you just see how federal attorneys and federal judges were dealing with every single important issue that this country has faced for the last 100 years. You know, whether it was administering New Deal programs during the Depression, or supporting the war effort kind of in the 1940s, drafting civil rights legislation, staffing special counsels during Watergate and other investigations like that, figuring out the legality of the Affordable Care Act, just everything. And so that's what From the Headlines does. And then we have kind of this timeline that just runs through the whole book, and it's just select historic events that just really show the gradual building of the Federal Bar Association. And we organized it in 20-year chunks. So each 20 years gets its own chapter in the book. And we hope by organizing it that way that you can approach the history however you want. You could, in fact, do it from 1920 to 2020, or you could just flip around almost like it's a yearbook, you know, like, and when we talked to you about designing this, I think that was the look, that was the feel that you really wanted, not necessarily a yearbook, but like sort of a showpiece that people could kind of dive into and pull out of as they wanted.
So, what's something that people may be surprised to know that you learned from doing all this research?
There are, I'm sorry, but it's a little bit of a loaded question. I got so into the history of the Federal Bar Association when I was writing this. There are so many different ways to answer that, but the thing I always come back to is that the first national president, the founding president of the Federal Bar Association, James W. Whitten, was born before the Civil War. He was born in 1855 in Missouri. And he was called Judge Whitten throughout his career, from what I could tell in my research, not because he ever actually sat on the bench anywhere, as we understand it, but because most of his career was with the Department of the Interior, specifically working in the General Land Office, and he administered land claims kind of when the country was opening the frontier, and he just kind of came to be called judge. It's this very dramatic, romantic sort of history. And he was the guy in 1920 who decided that there really needed to be a federal bar association. Just all kinds of interesting things. The first African American member of the bar association, Louis MEHLINGER, who became a member of the FBA in 1944 or 1945, was the son of a freed slave who was born in Mississippi, and he was a senior attorney with the Department of Justice. The first female national president, Marguerite Raywalt, she served during the war, and she instituted these really popular weekly luncheons. And at one point in 1943, had Eleanor Roosevelt speak at one of them about a visit that she had just made to troops in the South Pacific. Just lots, there are just so many other stories like that. Another national president was helped prosecute the Nuremberg war crimes trials at the end of the war. Another president helped draft not just helped, but drafted the legislation that created NASA. there was a national president who went on to become a Supreme Court justice, Tom C. Clark, and he was also a national president. And he was a Supreme Court justice until his son, Ramsey Clark, who was also a national president of the FBA, became Attorney General. And Tom C. Clark swore him in, and then he stepped down from the Supreme Court to avoid any conflicts of interest or anything like that. So this really storied history, and also just this kind of little footnote. The olive in the martini, as it were, is that the FBA used to run basically this cocktail lounge in downtown DC that was called the National Lawyers Club. That was the hub of the federal legal community for quite a number of years.
So to talk a little bit more about the Lawyers Club. So right now I'm sitting in our national office in our commercial condo space in Arlington, Virginia. But I actually started working for the Bar Association when we were on 1815 H Street in DC. So tell me a little bit more about the Federal Bar Building.
The Federal Bar Building was, in a lot of ways, just the ultimate symbol of the United States at that time. It was, to me, it's such a symbol of that post-war boom and that period of post-war optimism. Like, of course, why wouldn't the Federal Bar Association have its own headquarters building that was 17 stories tall, 3 blocks from the White House, and cost $2 or $3 million at the time? But it was a really amazing, nice building. It was kind of the brainchild of a national president named Earl Kintner, who there's actually one of the FBA's National Leadership Awards is still named after him today because of his dedication to the FBA. He was a former national president of the FBA, former president of the foundation of the FBA, and then was the first and founding president of the Federal Bar Building Corporation. And he just was convinced that the FBA needed a really just an official headquarters building. It had always rented office space kind of throughout DC. And so thanks to him, he even, I believe, personally guaranteed kind of the loan that ended up building the building. And so he spearheaded the design and construction of this building. Ground was broken in 1960. Then Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren himself wielded the shovel and broke ground. 2 years later, the building was dedicated, and Earl Warren spoke at that dedication, and so did then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. The building itself, like I said, was 15 or 16 stories tall, maybe 17. I'm not remembering the exact number right now, but it was tall. And right, as you said, at 1815 8th Street, a couple blocks from the White House, it had space for the FBA's professional office staff. It had a law library. And it had the National Lawyers Club, which is what I was just talking about. And that was this sort of social space. It included a dining room, a terrace, a lounge, a bar, meeting space for any lawyers who wanted to have meetings. And from what I could tell, just kind of looking through the FBA's own internal publications and documents, it was like I said, a real hub. Like it had hours. It was open till like after midnight most nights, and for a good couple decades, it was a real social hub. And I want to go off script just for a second, Stacy, and ask you: was the National Lawyers Club still open when you worked in that building?
It wasn't. So I actually only worked in that building from August to November, and that they had already sold the building, and then we moved over to M Street in, I guess, November. So okay. I only got to work in it for a very, very short time.
It still must have been really fascinating. And then it was so successful, and basically, and then the FBA rented out most of the space in the building, so they also made money off it because they were smart lawyers. And then so that opened in 1962, and then 5 years later, in 1967, they built and opened the Federal Bar Building West. At right next door, right at I think it was 1819 H Street, and that was really more just an investment. And then, as you said, about 30 years later, in 1997, they made the decision that it made more sense, given the FBA's priorities at that point as an organization, to stop spending all of its time basically on building maintenance and to just move into a property that was still in DC and that made more sense for the organization. But yeah, for a while, it was really the FBA's kind of flagship structure. I mean, it was this literal monument to the Federal Bar Association, right in the heart of the federal capital.
I remember the grand marble flooring, and I think it had like Lady Justice in it. But
Yeah.
it was a while ago. It was a long time ago.
And there are several pictures in the book. If people are interested in seeing this, if you just page through, you'll see there is a photo of that gleaming marble floor,
Hmm.
with, I believe, a picture of the two Earls on it, Earl Kintner and Earl Warren, shaking hands on top of that embossed seal.
Hmm. So, what's changed the most about the FBA over its first 100 years?
What's changed the most, I think, is it's not what I would call sort of the FBA's fault. It's not good or bad. It's just it is what it is. I think the FBA has changed in exactly the way the federal government that it serves has changed. You know, as the federal government has gotten so much bigger and so much more complicated, and especially so much less centralized in Washington, D.C., that's what has happened to the Federal Bar Association. You know, if you look back at those early newspaper articles, those early notes in the Federal Bar News newsletter, it's crazy to people like us who work in the 21st century just how intimate a community Washington D.C. used to be. I mean, it's there are there are just Supreme Court justices who just are almost casual members of the FBA, or they'll just show up to speak at a moment's notice at a luncheon because they can, because nothing else is going on, you know. And
Hmm.
it was a time when organizations like the FBA they they were social organizations like they are today, but not like we understand them. I mean, like I said, they were like almost fraternal organizations. Like they were just part of members' social lives. You know, people, and back then people they would kind of go out more. They would be a lot more intimately involved in organizations like that. And so that's how the Federal Bar Association's changed. Not that it is not an important networking and social organization, but you know, the FBA has spread across the country like the government has. And you know, from that first meeting where a president was elected and there was a vice president and a treasurer, I think, and that's it. And
Hmm.
now you look at today, and the federal the governance is a board of directors and 12 sections, which were originally called circuits because they match the 12 circuits of the federal judiciary. Um,
Hmm.
and there are regional conferences all across the country and in some cases the world. Um, and so I think that's how the FBA has changed. It's in some ways it's followed the profession out of
Hmm.
Washington D.C. and across the country.
So, what do you think has changed the least?
What's changed the least, I think, is what the FBA stands for. You know, it originally, most directly, it started out of the issue of compensation, of pay, fair pay. There was this in 1919, the federal government Congress appointed the Joint Congressional Commission on Reclassification of Salaries, and it was this bipartisan commission that tried to make sense of basically federal employment scales, because right after World War One, the United States is more prominent on the global stage than it's ever been. We kind of need the administrative and infrastructure muscle to to just to run a government. And and it was realized that just federal pay rates had not kept up. In some cases, they were decades out of date. There was no rhyme or reason to when people would get raises or what qualifications you needed for any job. So this congressional committee took it upon itself to solicit testimony and kind of draft new fairer pay scales. And a big part of that was federal attorneys and federal judges. And James Whitten, who went on to become the first national president of the FBA and the founding president, was tasked by his fellow federal attorneys to represent them during the committee, and he testified about that at the committee about just disparities in federal legal and judicial pay. And then afterwards, he realized that there was real merit in having an association, an ongoing association that would represent the interests of the legal community like that. And 100 years later, that is still a primary concern of the FBA. It's certainly, I don't have to tell you, not the only concern, but it is still a bedrock concern. As as recently as the early 2000s, the FBA partnered with the ABA on two different reports on federal judicial pay, warning that federal judicial pay had fallen way behind, and that judges' earning power was significantly being eroded. And those reports were presented by the FBA and the ABA directly to um, the Chief Justice at the Supreme Court at the time. So even if you look at all the way back then, this seemed to be um, a concern that maybe wouldn't last, but in fact it has. And also from the very beginning, education was just always an important component, and really elevating the profession. Contributing to the science of jurisprudence and the sound administration of justice. And those are things all the way through. If you look at the FBA's programs today, if you look at this very annual meeting and the programs that people have been attending, that hasn't changed. There are definitely a lot of things I think that people who were members in the 1920s would recognize today, that yes, this is still their FBA.
So people don't know this, but throughout this entire process, you and I have sat down, we've had these kind of conversations. Basically every time you were in the office doing research, you would always tell me some, fun facts or your favorite stories.
Yeah.
And I'm always so impressed how much you remember, which I'm not kidding that you can now be considered the federal bar historian. But and I'm super sad that this project is coming to an end now. But what's a great story to sort of end this conversation on?
As I told you, when you asked me what people would be surprised to know about the federal bar, like there are so many possibilities to choose from. But I'll pick one person, Dr. J. Clay Smith Jr. He was the first national president who was African American. He served in 1980 to 81, and he just is a fascinating guy, and just so emblematic of the Federal Bar Association. He had this amazing career. He was always active in the government in a few different positions, but that culminated at where he was interim commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But he also went on to be the dean of the Howard University School of Law. He was a very accomplished musician and composer. If you look in the book, there's a great photo of him playing piano during an FBA annual meeting when he was president. So he was doing this while he was president. He researched and wrote books, a lot of them about Black attorneys who were trailblazing in their own way. And maybe my favorite part about him is I mentioned a couple of minutes ago Louis MEHLINGER, who was the first African-American member of the FBA. While he was president, Dr. Smith took the time to research and write this kind of long scholarly paper all about Louis MEHLINGER and his contributions, not just to the Federal Bar Association, but to the Black legal community in Washington, D.C., where Mr. MEHLINGER had co-founded the Washington Bar Association. And actually, it was to the Washington Bar Association that Dr. Smith presented his paper. And to me, that is a perfect FBA story, just that Dr. Smith felt it was important to honor the past that way, in a way that was kind of building a bridge for the organization into the future. And now that I'm thinking about it too, there's one other story, Stacy, if you'll permit me, just a very FBA story, because I've been talking so much about the more distant past, and much more recently, in the late 80s and early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the Eastern Bloc fell apart. This is really amazing to me too. The FBA created something called the DDI, the Democracy Development Initiative, and Federal Bar Association members, attorneys and judges went to Russia, went to countries like Azerbaijan in the former Soviet bloc, and literally helped bring democracy to those countries. They were asked to, and it's to come on a volunteer basis, which they all did for free. And they helped write constitutions. They helped create court systems. They really brought the rule of law to these countries that had not practiced the rule of law as we understood it in Western democracies. And that is the FBA. And when you ask what's changed the most, that's a great example of the FBA taking its mission outside of Washington, D.C., and really bringing the rule of law kind of across the country and out of the country around the world. So that maybe is the perfect note to end on.
I think it is the perfect way. Thanks so much for being a part of our Centennial and helping us really to bring the story of the FBA to life. If I had some champagne, I would I would do some cheers with you right now. But all I can say is I can't wait for the next 100 years, and I hope I'll be able to bring you back and at some point in time, and we can talk more about the FBA. But thanks so much for being here.
It's been wonderful to be part of this project. Thanks, Stacy.
Thanks.